and so like, while I was obviously like somewhat surprised to sort of find the Asian lung Twitter to be like grounded in something, also not that surprised, because, like, it's circumstances, right? And white supremacy, and power have to sort of come to grips with how to maintain their power and legitimize it, right?
And you just remind me of something, thinking about the relationship to that and the question of labor. One of the things that I found when I was doing research on the Crownsville State Hospital, which is just outside of Baltimore, or no, just outside of Annapolis, Maryland, is the sort of the labor regimes that come along as part of the labor regimes overlapping with the treatment regimes of the hospital, right? That there's this idea that industrial therapy, right, is what is needed for Black psychiatric patients. And I think it links back to these questions, the same kinds of questions that people are raising after emancipation, that somehow the control, the surveillance, the violence of slavery is somehow beneficial and in some ways therapeutic to Black people, right? That they need this to survive. And I think it's another one of those things where the afterlives, again, are many, right? And it's the same thing when you think about cases of incarceration, right? That labor is somehow part of the reform of carceral institutions, right? And in order for that labor to be reforming, it of course cannot be under fair conditions or fairly compensated or any of those things, right? Like the labor has to be exploitative in order for the incarcerated to benefit from it, right? And this is used to justify all kinds of really heinous labor practices in that existed historically in asylums, but also currently exist in carceral institutions. I think about, for example, I did my master's at the University of Maryland, and one of the policies, and I don't know if this is uniform for all of the campuses, but all of the furniture that we used in like grad student offices and lounges and things like that was all sourced from like the Maryland Department of Corrections. And it's thus made by incarcerated people. And there would be even like placards like on the bottom of the furniture like that said Maryland Department of Corrections on them, right? And I think this isn't unique to Maryland, but it's again the sort of overlap between the sort of the racial dimensions, but also the relationship between incarceration, labor, and therapy and reform, put that in quotes, reform, because it doesn't operate, I think, in the ways a lot of people think it does.
Of course.
Just a quick note that the exact same relationship is in place between Western Washington University, where I am, and the Washington Department of Corrections. I mean, they are legally required to buy furniture, etc., but then also all food provisions. So I haven't been on campus like in 3 years, or because you can't. It's just really interesting to think about how you have this incapacitated population being in some way like coerced into buying the food that is produced by yet another and more significantly incapacitated population, and the same food vendor sells to the university and the local jail. I think it's changing, but it's just fascinating to actually see the corporate, this vertical integration and the corporate presence, which to my mind is something that I guess I would like to see that talked about more in terms of what we're going through. It sure seems like we've been talking about the expendability of people, but I think the point is that, having monopolized the production of ventilators, why produce situations or scenarios in which scarcity and these sort of austerity practices are legal is a concern for me, I guess.
Yeah, and it reminds me of your earlier point, Katie, about jails and the way that jails and prisons have been perhaps some of the hardest hit areas in the country in terms of COVID-19. I think I read something that like Rikers infection rate was like 6 times the national average, and so when we think about places of incarceration as places of discipline, and as places of labor, right? I think it's very difficult to ignore the ways that people who are incarcerated, as well as the people who are essential workers, essentially experience this same tension under COVID capitalism, which is that they are at once essential and expendable, and I think it's devastating to see work out in real time.
It's so interesting too to think about these as kind of somewhat perversely places for the maintenance of life. And I say that thinking about incapacitation and thinking about wanting to keep them at a particular level of life, because I've been reading about sort of reports from people who are in fact incarcerated currently, and the thing that struck me, or one of the things that struck me, is that they do not have access to cleaning supplies because of the poison, like the potential for death, which is historically speaking has been one of the methods for suicide prevention, right? So thinking about the ways that you have this tension between wanting to disallow agentive acts of suicide, or agentive acts of death, right? Seeking death, but then on the other hand, needing, or sort of when we find ourselves in a crisis and pandemic, and the healthcare costs might, outweigh what the state is willing to pay, then you see the shift to abandonment in some way.